Alright, welcome everyone to the exploration tutorial for ghost sites and sleeper caches. So I'm here in GE Mothership, the new Keepstar, and I figured that I would start by going over my fit, and if you would like to see some alternative fits for other ships, including downgrades and Covert ops, they will be at the end of the video. In any case, this is what I typically run, an Astero, Covert ops Cloak and Sisters Core Probe Launcher. That's a safe downgrade to a Core Probe Launcher 1 if you'd like, but I would argue that if you're flying an Astero, this is definitely worth having. 5 meganewton YT8, although you can go with Enduring instead if you need more capacitor stability. However, if you do simulate this, and you turn off the armor rep, which you won't usually be using, it's stable with just the Microwarp, so you should be fine. In any case, I also use a Zeugma. This is definitely not necessary. This is the top of the line analyzer. You can either use just a normal Relic analyzer, either 1 or 2, or the Clavicula Frostline integrated, which is the middle ground. It can do both at the same time. Though you can take this cargo scanner out and put a Relic and data in if you'd like to do both Relic sites and ghost sites at the same time. Scan Rangefinding array, not strictly necessary, but if you don't have good scanning skills, it can definitely help with that. Lows are basically your choice. Just make sure that you have at least 1 Inertial Stabilizers in order to align under 2 seconds. The rest you should probably put tank modules in. Warp core stabilizers are going to make it very hard to lock cans at any considerable range, and it'll slow you down. And also, you will almost certainly just get out-tackled anyway, so not recommended. When a new lands on grid, cloak, don't attempt to out-stabilize their tackle. So now I'm going to get undocked, get into another system in Catch, and find a couple of each of the kinds of signatures, and I will see you back then. So we're going to start by actually scanning down a signature, and there are 4 in the system. You have 2 options. You can either sit cloaked on a Fortizar, tethered on a Fortizar, or you can sit cloaked at a Deep Space Tactical. In this particular system, I don't have a Deep Space Tactical, so I'm going to be on a Fortizar for this scan. You start by making sure that the entire red sphere is within your scan range, and then you should get a pinpoint on the first try. It's very rare to get a line on the first cycle. Okay, so there I identified a combat site right away. 2 of them actually. So we'll try one of the others in the system. Double-click the scene to rotate by 90 degrees, and then drag the front face of the cube in order to reposition the scan. It's the easiest way to manipulate the scan without having to pan around manually and use the arrows. Okay, so there we didn't get a conclusive identification, so you recenter. Depending on your skill level, you'll be able to go down by either 1 or 2 notches at a time. With 0.08 AU maximum scan deviation, I am able to go down 2 at a time, but it's not an issue if you have to go down by 1. So now that I have a couple of extra signatures in the system, and there's nobody here to bother me, I figured I'd do an advanced scanning tutorial, because especially if you do not have good scanning skills and you're not flying a Covops or an Astero, scanning down any of the site types that we're covering in this episode is going to be very difficult. But there are ways to get around it. So, obviously the basics: double-click the scene to rotate, just drag the front face of the cube to rearrange. You might notice that mine looks different than yours does by default. You can rearrange them by launching the pinpoint formation again. Alt and scroll will adjust the size, and then you can run your first scan. Now this is a combat site, but I'm going to scan it anyway for demonstration purposes. You may be able to go down 2 notches at a time, but that depends heavily on your scan deviation down here. If you can't, just go down 1 notch at a time. You'll have your scan radius each cycle. So I'm hoping this one turns into a line, so that I can demonstrate what you do in that situation. But it's entirely possible it'll just get identified instead. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to pretend like this is much harder to scan down than it actually is. Say this was your narrowest probe size, and you cannot get it to scan past this level. It's going to be somewhere closer to 98% if you can actually use this trick effectively, otherwise your scan strength is simply not high enough. But if you're running perfectly aligned scans like this over and over again and you're just not making any more progress, then the last thing that you can try is if you hold Control and you scroll in, your probes will become closer to a spherical shape. This will increase your effective scan strength at smaller radii. If that doesn't work, you can, if you hold Shift, rearrange each probe individually, but I've never found a use for it over just bringing the probes closer together. Okay, quick side note, I did actually manage to get one of these signatures to become a line, and if that does happen, that'll be if 3 probes register it, which is not really something you need to worry about, but easy way to tell which one it is, it's the one that's furthest from your original scan. So just reposition your scan to the one that's furthest, rerun it, you'll be good. Great. I'm not going to finish scanning down the signature, but I'm sure you understand how it would be done. So I found a covert research facility here, and one of the most helpful tricks for these is that you can set your default warp within distance to 18 kilometers. I believe that's 180, yes, 18 kilometers. And that will mean that when you do warp to it, you'll get that yellow exclamation mark. That means that as soon as you enter the grid, an invisible random timer will start ticking down to a point when NPCs will warp in, and then the cans will explode. If you're in a frigate, you will die instantly, so be careful of that. But the reason you want to warp in at 18 kilometers is that the first can is almost exactly 18 kilometers away. So sometimes it just pulls you into the middle anyway. Don't worry too much about it. If you have a powerful Afterburner, it doesn't matter. Databanks are slightly more valuable than mainframes. Usually prioritize those. Hack as fast as possible. Open the cargo, use the loot all button, and go to the next databank as fast as possible. You do not have time to waste. It's up to you whether you want to try for 2 or 3 cans. For this tutorial, I'm only going to do 2.
Warp drive active.
And we're out. As you can see, in each of those cans you can get covert research tools, which are incredibly valuable, so definitely worth doing these when you come across them. Just be very cautious if you're not running a ship that can tank the explosion. Next up we have the standard sleeper cache. With these, the first room is an acceleration gate, so there's no need to warp in at any specific distance, and the time limit doesn't start until you've gone through the gate. Also, the time is different, it's not just a random, it's triggered by failing any can, so if you're careful and you tiptoe around any potential enemies, you'll be fine. One thing that I'd like to address now, while I'm hacking in a low-stakes environment, is the rule of 6s, which states that in a node that has connections to all 6 adjacent nodes, if this center is not clear, then the core must be next to it. So if there is an enemy in this space, the core would have to be on one of those spaces. There's a chance that it is anyway. It was. It's just instinct, but... Alright, now take the gate. Logistic depot will signal to you that you're in a standard, so if you're not prepared for that, just read the signature in the probe scanner, but if you didn't, be even readier now. Now with these, once you hack your first can, you're going to trigger a remote alarm. So my recommendation would be lock them all up and cargo scan them to see if any of them have anything that's even worth taking. The remote defense grid unit here allows you to switch the turret activation from each side of the site to the other. I would highly recommend just ignoring it completely, going after as many of these cans as you can get in the 60 seconds that you are allowed. So by cargo scanning each one, 8.8, that's probably the highest we're going to get. So just burn towards it. Be very careful not to fail hacks in standard sleeper caches. You will raise the alert level, and in a lot of cases that can lead to you losing your ship if it's a frigate. You can see you have 60 seconds now, so if you have the time, you can hack a second can. I'm going to do that here. And once you've collected both cans, leave at your earliest opportunity. Because when that alarm sounds, the sentries will activate and a gas cloud will envelop the site. You do not want to be there in an Astero at that point. And if you're in a Heron, which I would not recommend for standard sleeper caches, only limited, then you will die in pretty much one hit to that gas cloud. But anyway, now we're out. We'll go to the next type site. So now I'm just at a standard Relic site where I can't lose this very expensive ship. I just wanted to cover the basics of hacking and moving from can to can. So I'll hack a little slower this time. I was in a big hurry at the Covert site. But that was actually a mistake. You shouldn't kill any enemies that you do not need to. And look at the opposite side of the board for the core, because it's where it's most likely to be. Perfect. Now, I briefly talked about the rule of sixes already. However, an additional trick I'd like to show is if you set your default keep it range to 2250 meters, you will be far enough away to cloak at a moment's notice, and you will also be close enough to loot the can. Usually. If there are newts in the system, do not rely on that. Ensure that the keep it range has functioned properly and that you're 2,000 meters away, because occasionally it'll leave you at 1998, and the half a second that it takes you to realize that is enough to get tackled. When you do meet a virus suppressor or a restoration node, you must kill them immediately. You stand basically no chance of finishing the hack with one on the board, unless you've already exposed the core. And as I mentioned, I've already covered rule of sixes. And there's the core. Other than that, just use the keep it range. Make sure that your Microwarpdrive is on. You can cargo scan if you'd like. It's not really necessary because you're not allowed to cherry pick sites in Brave Space anyway. And I will see you back in the hangar for a fitting review. Part 2 of this lesson that we're going to host at this Relic site here, how to deal with newts entering the system. Now obviously there are no newts in the system right now, and I can't just summon them on command, but we're going to pretend that one comes into the system. The first thing you want to do is, well, it's up to you whether you want to continue to hack or just not take the risk and either dock up, cloak at your attack, or just leave the system entirely. But do be careful if there are multiple newts, especially simple farmers around. It may be gate camp. But even though I just finished that can hack, you can see that right now I'm 2,300 meters off. If anything shows up on my D-scan, you're 14.3 AU out. That means that in an interceptor or a fast tackle, you have less than 2 seconds of warning before they get on grid at 8 AU per second warp speed. That is not a lot of time, but if they don't see where you cloaked, they have no chance of tackling you, even if they brought a saber. If they see where you cloaked and you are not running a Covert Ops cloak, they're going to approach the spot where you were, drop you out of cloak, and then tackle you. With Covert Ops cloak, you have the advantage of being able to cloak and then warp out, which does somewhat neutralize the detrimental effects of your align time. If you do have Covert Ops Cloak, then this is pretty much enough. You can continue to explore with newts in the system. If you don't, I would highly recommend docking up the first sign of trouble. So, as I mentioned at the start, we're going to be going over some alternative fittings. So this is my Astero fitting, Discovery, it'll be in the description. This is the downgraded Heron fitting if you can't afford or can't fly the Astero. Very similar, only difference is you need to be a lot more careful with newts on grid because you do not have the ability to cloak and then warp out. You cannot use the cloak microwarp trick either because this does not have the space for a improved cloaking device too. Other than that, this is a very low level fit. I would not recommend flying this for any longer than absolutely necessary. Other than that, the other real option is the Buzzard, which is the Covert Ops frigate for Caldari, and it has all the standard Covert Ops bonuses, some light missile damage in case you ever decide that you want to fight somebody in this and immediately die, never do that again. But it is, at Covert Ops 5 it does have slightly stronger scan strength bonuses than the Astero, so it's definitely worth having. If you want to fit this, very similar to the Astero, rigs are basically your choice, but I went with Emission, Scope, and Gravity Capacitor, Cloak, and Probe Launcher. Obviously, Third High is not necessary. Then you just need a 1 meganewton Afterburner, because a microwarp will put you over power grid very quickly. A Zeugma or your analyzer/analyzers of choice in these two slots. Rangefinding arrays are my personal preference here, but they're not required if you have any other things you want to put in here. Just don't try and put tackle in here because you'll just die to anything that isn't also a Cov Ops frigate. Warp core stabilizers actually make sense for the Cov Ops frigates because they don't align under 2 seconds. So instead of attempting to get them down with inertial stabilizers, which gets you to about 5.5 seconds, which is an option if you do want to try and cloak and warp out, 2 warp core stabilizer 1s are good in that it will give you a little bit of time in between when the enemy gets disruption and scram on in order to get out. Not to be relied upon though. These are not nearly as safe to explore with in systems with newts as the Astero is. Anyway, those are all of the fits that I have for you. They'll be in the description, and I hope you've learned something today.